So the UFC is in the market for their next broadcast rights partner, with their 7-year deal with ESPN finishing up at the end of this year, 2025. Now I know most of you guys, definitely not me, I don't know what you're talking about, are sailing the 7 seas, thus don't really care what logo is on the top right corner of your Russian stream, but where the UFC lands in terms of its broadcast deal is of instrumental importance for the sport of MMA and really sets the direction of where the sport is going to go. The UFC moving to Netflix is one of the more interesting options, and there is a lot of speculation and chatter among fans that this is the move the UFC is going to make. So in this video we are going to talk about this possible move to Netflix for the UFC, what that means for the company and its fans, explore if Netflix even want the UFC's broadcast rights at all, and whether or not if I personally believe this deal is going to happen. Quick note, distribution and broadcast options differ greatly depending on where you are around the world. I know this firsthand, I'm based in Australia, and ESPN Plus I don't even think is a thing here. We're going to talk about the American broadcast rights, which is not only the most important for an American company, but often dictates what happens for the international broadcasts. The easy shout when speculating where the UFC is going to land with its upcoming broadcast deal is Netflix. At this stage, it's almost being manifested into existence with just how much everyone is speculating on this relationship. But shipping these two together does make almost perfect sense, as there is just so many things pointing to this coming into fruition. Reportedly, the UFC is asking for $1 billion per year for their broadcasting rights, which severely limits the options we are playing with here. This ain't power slap, we aren't going to end up on Rumble. Also pointing to this relationship happening is Netflix itself, who is, in response to every other media corporation starting their own streaming service and cannibalizing their value proposition, have identified live events as their diversification target in their portfolio and are investing hard in this. Finally, and most importantly, is that TKO, the parent company for the UFC, have already signed a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar deal with the WWE brand to host Monday Night Raw and essentially every other WWE product depending on the market. So it would be an unconventional business move to say the least, for TKO to sign the UFC to, say, Amazon Prime, a direct competitor to Netflix, really sour that relationship while there is still an active deal ongoing with one of their other brands. That is just not something suits do. In saying that, the WWE themselves do sign different broadcast deals internally between their Raw and SmackDown brands, which is a much different situation to what we're talking about here, but it does show precedent and doesn't guarantee Netflix to be an absolute lock for the UFC. It's also worth mentioning that there really hasn't been any public interest from Netflix to sign the UFC, but we will come back to this when we ask the question if Netflix actually want the UFC. But for now, let's just pretend they do and talk about if Netflix makes sense for the UFC first. When answering whether Netflix makes sense for the UFC, the question becomes, what does Netflix provide access to that ESPN or TNT or any of the more traditional sports broadcasters don't? The answer for TKO when signing the WWE to Netflix was to expand its global reach and gain access to a larger audience and gain flexibility in content and standards. So breaking this down, it makes perfect logical sense. Netflix has reportedly about 300 million paid subscribers, 100 million of those are just from Europe and the Middle East. This means that the WWE can have one broadcast partner and be fairly confident that in most markets anywhere in the world would have access to that provider. This is opposed to when they were with the USA Network, which next to no other country has access to, so WWE would have to manage a complex chain of international broadcasters and sub-broadcasters. This is a huge headache, and cuts into profits have to be made just to manage this. The next part of TKO's reasoning to moving to Netflix for the WWE was to gain flexibility in content and standards. So with Netflix, there really isn't a broadcast time restraint or time slots like there are on a traditional network. So if the WWE wanted to go 5 minutes, 35 minutes over their original planned schedule, they can. This allows for more flexibility in their promos and matches themselves. The content will also then live forever on Netflix, so that fans have easier access to replays and opens up the product to those who can't watch live for whatever reason. So to be completely honest, I don't watch the WWE personally, so I got in touch with a friend who does, who was kind enough to give me this insight and his opinion, which is, from a consumer perspective, this move to Netflix for the WWE has been great. A slight caveat is that we are in Australia, which gets every product the WWE makes through Netflix, all 3 brands and premium live events. He also already had a Netflix subscription prior to the move, which of course is an important factor when factoring in costs. But in general, the feeling is that Netflix has made access to the WWE cheaper for fans and more convenient for fans. This all sounds fantastic, but let's explore if these same benefits would be apparent for the UFC and their fans. So starting again with international access, it's hard to argue with Netflix's sheer international reach. Each market has its own quirks, but across the board on average, Netflix is going to be one of the most convenient and easier to access platforms no matter where you are in the world. I don't believe many fans would sign up to Netflix just for the UFC, with the 7 seas as populated and easy to access as it currently is. But fans with an active subscription already, I'm sure would be happy to get that extra value, and you're going to get a non-negligible audience who are willing to watch the UFC for the first time just because it's on their Netflix recommended. In all, this would be good for the UFC. After 7 years on ESPN, it's fair to say you've captured a good chunk of that audience already, and Netflix provides a new and broader market to be exposed to. The flexibility and shelf life of content is also beneficial to the UFC, but probably not as important as it was for the WWE. The UFC would benefit from a non-time slot end, especially for their fight nights. We've all seen it, we've all been annoyed by it, that quick first round finish and then the UFC/ESPN broadcast has to kill time with a stampede of ads and the most mid-mundane punditry you've ever heard. Not having to finish at a particular time would help these non-pay-per-view broadcasts in terms of pacing, which of course as a fan would be amazing. As for the content living in the library of Netflix, I still have a Fight Pass subscription and I would hate for that to be discontinued because you just know not everything in the library is going to make it on Noah's Ark over to Netflix. Like would Pride Final Conflict 2005 be on Netflix? Doubt it. So personally not a benefit to me and potentially an active disimprovement unless they also kept Fight Pass simultaneously, but for $1 billion I'm sure you'd want to be the exclusive holder. But more in the short term, if you've missed out on a card live, it would be nice to have a confident place to watch a replay, skip straight to the fight you want and play that game where you don't open Instagram for spoilers, but inevitably do just through muscle memory. So there are a lot of benefits here for the UFC and for fans, especially if you already have a Netflix subscription. However, all in all, the UFC likely don't care about anything beyond the money behind this deal, and I'm sure a lot of fans don't care as long as their 7C streams are still active. So the bigger question then becomes, do Netflix actually want the UFC, especially for that $1 billion per year price tag? I don't believe that Netflix actually wants the broadcast rights for the UFC, at least comparing enthusiasm to the WWE, and I think this for a few reasons. Primarily, I don't think Netflix is quite ready to fully enter the pay-per-view market, at least on the scale necessary to broadcast the UFC, and I don't think the UFC is willing to move away from the pay-per-view model just yet. Commercial pay-per-views are still an extremely important aspect to the UFC's product. Sports bars, regular bars, theatres all still get charged huge costs to show the UFC in their venue. The UFC, by eliminating pay-per-views or even dramatically reducing the cost of pay-per-views to the individual, will mean less people will watch it at bars, meaning less bars will pay for the commercial licenses. And if that math worked out, we would have much cheaper pay-per-views years ago. Also acknowledging that WWE has moved away from the pay-per-view model, so TKO already have every insight, every point of data on whether the pay-per-view model is most lucrative for the UFC, and they haven't changed it yet or showed any indication that they will even explore other pricing models. So the pay-per-view model isn't going anywhere just yet for the UFC, or at least I don't think so, and Netflix don't have the infrastructure to handle mass pay-per-view. And if numbered UFC events is going to be their only pay-per-view offering, the investment into that infrastructure can't be worth it. It would mean, on top of having to pay the UFC $1 billion per year just for the broadcast rights, Netflix would also have to pay the infrastructure cost to set up pay-per-views, and then the cost to set up commercial pay-per-views, and then cost to police venues using commercial pay-per-views. It's just a lot, and do the UFC even want to be the test dummies for Netflix? Just look at how Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson went. ESPN started doing pay-per-views all the way back in 1999. By the time they signed the UFC, they had all the infrastructure to handle and distribute the product, and even with all this experience, it still goes wrong quite often. Netflix have shown that they are still very much working out the kinks with live events, and the UFC, which essentially runs weekly, is a straight into the deep end type move. The next doubt I have around Netflix wanting the UFC is around hosting that fight library. Look, I'm a hardcore MMA fan, I have an active Fight Pass subscription, but I'm only ever going back to watch certain fights or the absolute best MMA events. I'm not going back to watch the entire prelims of UFC Fight Night Reyes vs Weidman. The WWE is effectively a soap drama, so it makes sense to upload every episode of Raw and SmackDown because it is a scripted TV show. You're going to have people who want to watch every Raw from the year 2000 or whatever. Hosting a UFC fight library would have to be heavily curated to just must-watch fights and events, most of which are free on YouTube already, I might add. I just don't see how hosting a library of sports replays would be worth the huge server costs required, and if we're not going to do a fight library, we are kinda missing out the point of Netflix, which at its core is still and probably will forever be a subscription-based content library. I think if we were being reasonable, a Netflix UFC broadcast deal would essentially be just that. Netflix hosts the UFC events live, the replay lives there for about 2 or 3 months, and then it gets removed and put on Fight Pass. I don't think this aligns with Netflix's business model, and if they were shifting towards that direction, again, this is an expensive way to jump into the deep end. So do I think the UFC will sign with Netflix? No clue, mate. Ultimately, it's going to be about money. Aren't you glad you watched right up to this point for that answer? But I do think that the value provided to Netflix by the UFC is just not there. And if it were to happen, it would be a pretty ambitious move by Netflix. Do I want the UFC to move to Netflix? If it means less ads, less dead air, and on-demand replays, 100%. Thank you to everyone who made it to the end of this video. Let me know in the comments below if you care in the slightest on whether UFC signs its broadcast rights to, or if this is just background activities. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all in the next video.